Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our career seminar. And today I have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Dawn Bell. Dr. Dawn Bell is a graduate of the University of Florida PharmD program, as well as she did her postgraduate work here as well. And so from that work that she did and moving forward, she went to University of West Virginia, where she was a tenured professor. And from there, she moved on to industry, and she has had quite a career in industry, having increasing responsibilities and roles. And so she's going to share with us today her pathway and tell some stories about her career development, and a little bit of her philosophy. So prior to doing that, just a few housekeeping items regarding students with your co-curricular credit. So a poll will pop up. Please respond to that poll, and that'll give you the information to move forward and claim your credit. And then for pharmacists on, you will receive an email after this presentation, and that'll direct you to complete the evaluation form. And that evaluation form will then be used to answer evaluations and get credit. You have to register for the seminar to get that email, so please be sure to register. And the registration is through the flyers that we sent out. So with that, I will hand this over to Dr. Bell, and she will walk us through her careers and experiences and provide some insights for us. So,
super. Thank you. Oh, sorry. That's a really good way to start off the seminar, right? With my phone ringing. Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Uhay. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here, and it's always great to be a Florida Gator. And one of the things that I wanted to start off talking about is my gratitude to the University of Florida for giving me this fantastic training, and to say to all of you, especially the students out there, that I know you're thinking about all these big decisions that you need to make, about your career as you go through the curriculum and as you graduate. But I want you to know you already have the golden ticket. You will be a Gator pharmacist, and with that training behind you, you are very fortunate to have one of the most versatile training programs for a career in healthcare that I can imagine. And so whatever it is, you've already won. Do some experiments. The title of my talk is Experiments in Innovation. Just see what you like, see what you're good at, see what you're best at, and just try a lot of different things when you're out there. You really can't make a fatal mistake because you're a Gator pharmacist, so you've got it. So next slide, please. So I spent probably the first third of my career practicing evidence-based medicine. And I really enjoyed that part of my career, taking care of patients one at a time. It's certainly a noble and rewarding way to use your Doctor of Pharmacy degree. But the last 2/3 of my career I've spent differently, working with teams that actually develop the therapeutics and the evidence that we use to practice evidence-based medicine. And with this career, you can impact lives of patients really at a global scale. And I find that very exciting to be able to have that kind of impact with my Doctor of Pharmacy degree that I didn't really even imagine that I could have when I was doing my training program in Florida. And so it just goes to show you that, the world really is your oyster, and there's lots of things that this Doctor of Pharmacy degree will prepare you to do. So I think it's important that we, obviously I work for Novartis, it's one of the top big pharma companies. And I think it's really important to address the elephant in the room before, I get into some of the stories and the, kind of the arc of my career. And it's no secret that the pharmaceutical industry enjoys or doesn't enjoy a very good reputation amongst Americans and probably around the world as well. This data is actually from the US. And I think, in many cases, that is a justified opinion. There have been some egregious cases and luckily mostly isolated cases. But I tell you what, when my family asks me, how do I feel working for Big Pharma? I tell them without hesitation, I am proud. I am proud because we make miracles that you can hold in the palm of your hand. Next slide. Can Give me the next slide, Dr. Uhe. Thank you. So I don't know if you guys know this, and I actually learned this quite recently, but in the entire history of the FDA, there have been less than 2,000 drugs approved. Less than 2,000 in the entire history of the FDA. And of course, many of these drugs will be the same mechanism of action, kind of me too's, if you will. So when you think about this in that context, developing a new drug is a really big deal, especially a drug with a new mechanism of action or a new platform like a biologic, like an antibody or gene therapy. This is a really, really big deal. We have to unlock over 4,000 years of evolution in human biology. We have to figure out the chemistry if you're working with a small molecule like the one in this slide, the physics if you're working with biologics. You have to be able to make it consistently with high quality at scale every time. That is not an easy thing to do, especially with biological therapies. You have to be able to do that at the right price so that you can have a sustainable business and have a profit in there. And you have to conduct clinical trials that generates the evidence that will convince the regulators that the drug is safe and effective, that will convince prescribers that it's the right drug for their patient at the right time, and convince payers that it's worth buying. These are very tall orders, but I tell you what, every one of these activities that is necessary to bring a new medicine to patients, you have the skill set to contribute to that process. And that's what's, I think, very exciting about being a pharmacist in the innovation industry. Now, I want to give you a little context on this slide because there's a great story behind this slide. So the miracle that is in the palm of this hand here, there are two stories there. One is that the miracle itself is a medicine called Entresto, and I'll talk a lot more about Entresto later because that has probably been the highlight of my career, to bring Entresto to patients. And the palm in this particular picture is a fellow pharmacist by the name of David Epstein. Now, at the time this picture was taken, David Epstein was the CEO of Novartis Pharma, and he's a graduate of Rutgers University College of Pharmacy. So it just goes to show you that a pharmacy degree can take you very far indeed. David has retired from Novartis, and he's now a venture capitalist with Flagship Pioneering, one of the top biotech venture capital firms in the world. Next slide. So my title of my talk was, risk-taking and career development, smart risk-taking. And so I wanted to talk to you today and tell you some stories around transition points in my career that involved smart risk-taking. And so this is the first of those stories. So, because it would be very boring for me just to say, go through my career chronologically. I thought this might be more interesting for you and help you to understand the contributions that you can make in this industry with a Doctor of Pharmacy degree. So the first inflection point in my career was when I decided to leave academia for industry. So I, like Dr. Uhe, started my career in academia. I was at West Virginia University, as he mentioned. But prior to that, I had completed a residency at University of Illinois at Chicago, and then a fellowship training in cardiovascular medicine back in Gainesville, with every intention of going on the tenure track and making my lifelong career in academia. But after about 6 years in academia, earning tenure and getting promoted to associate professor, frankly, I was profoundly unhappy. It just wasn't a good fit for me. And I had been doing some consulting with mostly small entrepreneurial biotech companies. And I really liked the consulting work that I was doing. And I came to realize I liked that work more than my full-time job at the university. And so when I made my decision to leave academia, this was a really big decision to make, obviously, to be tenured and then to decide to leave academia after, working for that so hard. I joined a company called The Medicines Company. And so the Medicines Company was young. They were fast growing. They had money in the bank, so it wasn't like, they were a fly-by-night operation, but they were still very high risk. In fact, their lead product, Bivalirudin, was still in phase 3 clinical trials when I joined, and they really had this only one product at the time. So if that clinical trial had been negative, the company would have gone bankrupt. And so it was indeed a very, very high risk. But why was it smart? So you can certainly see why it would be risky. But why was it a smart risk? So it's important I certainly believed in the science, and importantly, I believed in the leader, Clive Meanwell, who founded the Medicines Company. He's a MD, PhD, very smart clinician, one of the smartest people, frankly, I've ever met, even to this day. And I believed in him, and I believed in some of the early data I had seen in the product. But importantly, I had firsthand information and firsthand knowledge of the unmet need that bivalirudin was designed to fill. So bivalirudin, or Angiomax as its brand name is a safer version of the anticoagulant heparin. And so we used it as a substitute for heparin in certain cardiac procedures like coronary angioplasty and stenting. So the problem with heparin in the setting is that it was unpredictable and frankly not very effective. So often we would couple the heparin with powerful intravenous antiplatelet agents to prevent damage to the patient's heart that could occur during the procedure. The challenge is that those antiplatelet agents had safety issues. It caused a lot of bleeding. But bivalirudin was fast acting, it was highly effective, and with a very short, predictable half-life. So this fast on, fast off features of bivalirudin's pharmacokinetics made it a perfect fit for these types of procedures. And the benefit was that you could get similar efficacy to heparin plus these powerful platelet inhibitors with a much, much better safety profile. And so in my clinical experience at the time, bivalirudin was coming into clinical trials, and I learned of the company. I was learning from my nurses in the coronary care unit that we were seeing a lot more bleeding and transfusions required with the implementation of more use of these intravenous antiplatelet agents. People, were just bleeding and requiring transfusions. Something we didn't see in the clinical trials, by the way, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then it turns out, it wasn't just our hospital, in West Virginia. You might think, oh, maybe you guys are doing something wrong, you're in West Virginia. But no, even the Cleveland Clinic, which is, world-renowned cardiovascular institution at the time, it was being led by Eric Topol in interventional cardiology. They found a very similar result with very high transfusion rates when these particular combination of drugs were used. And so why didn't we see this in the clinical trials? Our patient populations were actually quite similar to the way that the drugs were studied in the clinic. Why were our patients having all this bleeding? So it turns out the clinical trials used a definition for bleeding adopted from an earlier class of drugs called the thrombolytics, things like TPA. And these drugs were used in saving people's lives who were having heart attacks. And so a higher level of bleeding was tolerated in those studies. And the definition of bleeding used in the clinical trial was really meant to define catastrophic bleeding. You didn't want something too sensitive in those trials, because then you just, like everyone, looks like they're bleeding and you can't really differentiate, what's important bleeding and what's not. So we adopted these same definitions in our angioplasty trials, where you have a lot less bleeding anyway. And we weren't able to see, we certainly could rule out catastrophic bleeding. So we knew these drugs didn't cause this kind of catastrophic bleeding, but we weren't able to pick up on the more subtle bleeding that was still very clinically important, leading to transfusions, because the definitions weren't sensitive enough. So in this role in this company, I not only helped as part of a team to bring bivalirudin to patients who needed it, but we also changed the definition of bleeding that were used in subsequent acute coronary syndrome trials and antiplatelet trials. And that new definition of bleeding is actually still being used to this day, so that we can better differentiate bleeding from things like ticlopidine and clopidogrel and drugs like that, that do have some risk of bleeding, but not the catastrophic bleeding we saw with thrombolytic agents. So I was at the medicines company for about 6 or 7 years. And in that time, I did a lot of different things. One of the wonderful things about working with a small, fast-growing company like the medicines company, I was employee number 40, by the way, so pretty early in its trajectory, is that I got to see everything and do things that really weren't in my job description. I would be in meetings with the president and CEO on a weekly basis, talking high-level strategy down to nitty-gritty tactics. So it was a really great learning experience. I started off, my title was actually Director of Pharmacy Affairs, and I had done a lot of work in outcomes research as an academic. And so that was what I did, is I worked with hospital pharmacies and with our key accounts team and our health economics team to help hospitals understand the impact of bivalirudin on their pharmacy budgets, as well as on their medical budgets and their patient outcomes. And we helped to build models for our top institutions to understand that. So that was, and that was part of the bivalirudin launch that I did that work. As the company grew, I ended up running all of medical affairs for Bivalirudin, and that includes additional data generation. So any studies that we did after approval is kind of fits into that in that department. Medical education activities. I also had a nursing education department that reported into me, because nurses are a really important stakeholder for the post-angioplasty care. And then eventually, as the company grew more, we acquired another product called Cangrelor, which was since approved as Kengrial after I left the company. And Cangrelor was an intravenous short-acting platelet inhibitor. We thought it's sort of like, actually, Cangrelor is exactly ticlopidine in the IV form. So it's developed by AstraZeneca, and they sell ticagrelor, not ticlopidine, ticagrelor, excuse me, and Cangrelor is the IV form of ticagrelor. And so we took that into coronary angioplasty, and in that role, when I moved over to the Cangrelor team, I led the design of that clinical development program. So 10,000 patient coronary angioplasty trials. And I chaired the steering committee for those trials, working side by side with some of the top interventional cardiologists in the world, all over the world, to design and execute those trials. So that was a really fabulous experience with the Medicines Company. And I think obviously the medicines, the phase 3 clinical trial early on with Bivalirudin was successful. The company was wildly successful. And even after I left, they went on to have even more success. And just last year, the Medicines Company developed an important new medicine called inclisiran, and Novartis bought the Medicines Company last year for nearly $10 billion. Yes, billion with a B. So very happy for my friend and founder, Clive Meanwell, for all the hard work that he put into that company over the last 25 years. So next slide, please. So working at the Medicines Company taught me a lot of things, and it gave me a passion for entrepreneurship. And so I decided, it wasn't necessarily my next job, but eventually I ended up founding a company, a biotech company, and I named it Cool Bio. And this was based on technology from Emory University, and it came from a theory that I did learn about when I was with the Medicines Company, about the need to protect patients during cardiopulmonary bypass. So so I won't bore you with the details of why why that theory is important, but suffice it to say, as all this blood is running through these rollers and all this tubing, it's not good for the blood. It causes a lot of trauma to the blood. And we felt like, and if you give an anticoagulant or an antiplatelet during that time it's going through the pump, it's helpful, but the challenge is nothing is short acting enough so that when you're ready to take the patient off of the bypass pump and then close them at the end of surgery, that the drugs, you don't want them to be active anymore, because you want the patients to clot and to, not to bleed after you close the surgical field. So these scientists at Emory, it was a product of an interventional cardiologist and a biomedical engineer. They designed this fusion protein that had a temperature control switch. It was an antiplatelet with a temperature control switch. And the reason that's important is that cardiopulmonary bypass is done under conditions of hypothermia. So you cool the patient down, a good 10 degrees or so. And this molecule would be inactive at normal body temperature, but then it would allow platelet inhibition only during hypothermia. So we really thought this could work in cardiopulmonary bypass. And so we, being me and a friend of mine, I convinced to join me on this crazy endeavor. And we raised a little bit of money, and which was super, super hard, but we did raise a little bit of money. And then we put together the deal with Emory and some other academic collaborators. And we proceeded to try and replicate what the academics had done and published in a very nice, scientific peer-reviewed journal. And what we learned was that it's very difficult to replicate academics' work. In fact, 60% of all academic research done in this drug discovery kind of pathway cannot be replicated. And that's something I learned after the fact, but it was well known before then. And so you can see why this is a risk, right? Starting your own company is a huge risk. Why was it a smart risk? And one of the reasons this was a smart risk is that my co-founder and I did this as a side hustle. We did not quit our full-time jobs to do this. We were both working at the same company. We had permission from our management to do this on the side. There was no conflict. And so we were able to do that while we were still being able to deliver on our employment agreement and earn money, which is certainly important. But we learned a lot, which is why it was smart. He parlayed the network and his experience from CoolBio into a couple of subsequent jobs, and is absolutely living his dream of being head of translational medicine for a startup biotech company. He worked for a big company prior to that, and this is much better suited for him. So he's super happy. I built an amazing network, learned so much. And one of the things that I learned was that I really wanted to do this. I wanted to build a company like this from scratch, but that I had a lot to learn. So one of the things that I learned doing this is that raising money is really, really hard. And so the next time I would do a biotech company, I wanted to work with people who were already believed in the idea and who were willing to put up money up front before we even started, because it's a lot easier if you have the capital. The second thing I learned is that all roads lead to getting bought by a big company. Even Clive, my friend at the medicines company, had ran the medicines company for 25 years, but eventually he sold it to Novartis. So I would say all roads lead to M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and that I knew nothing about the companies that did that type of acquiring. Like, I hadn't worked in big pharma. I had always worked in small companies. So I thought, okay, it's time. I need to learn better drug development skills, and I need to learn, this, about this part of the industry that I know nothing about. So next slide. So enter Novartis. So how on earth is going to Novartis any kind of risk, you might ask yourself. It is a Fortune 50 company. It's, great pay, great benefits. It doesn't sound risky at all. It's smart, but maybe not risky. And I think the reason for me, the way I see this as a risk, and let me tell you, it felt like a risk when I was doing it, is that this was a really big job that I was able to get for Novartis. At Novartis, I feel very, very fortunate. This is a serious drug development organization. In fact, currently today, highest productivity pipeline in the industry, most approvals of any drug company last year. These people know how to do drug development. They're pros. And this was a big, big job, leading a drug development for an asset in heart failure. And I frankly, I didn't know if I could do it. It was a stretch for me. That was the risk. I had to take a bet on myself, that I could, be successful in an environment like that. Remember, the medicines company I joined when they had 40 employees. I left, it got a little too big for me. There were 220 employees. Novartis has 127,000 employees. So it was definitely a scale, incremental scale increase for how I was used to working. And at the time, no one knew it at the time, but I was put in charge of what would become one of the biggest drugs in Novartis history. And I'm certainly glad I didn't know that at the time, because I would have been terrified even more than I was. So that was just very, very, very good luck. So I did lead. I'm sure most of you have heard of Entresto, if you probably at least have seen the television ads, if you don't know much detail about the drug. So when I say I led the drug development team, what I mean is I led the entire drug development team, not just clinical. There's a role that we have at Novartis and many other large companies. They have different names, but at Novartis, we call this the global program head. And so that means that all of the functions that you need to develop a medicine, from phase 2 clinical trials through approval and reimbursement, I had on my team. So certainly the clinical development, medical affairs, health economics and patient access piece, the pieces I knew quite well, I had those people on my team, but I also had preclinical safety. I had manufacturing development, I even had the marketing, people reporting to me. That was all part of my rubric, intellectual property. I had everything you needed that you would want in a biotech company, every function to develop a drug from phase 2, all the way to the end, I had on my team. And so it was a really, a really big stretch for me, but one that I enjoyed, because I could see everything, and I learned a little bit about team building, and about how to get things done through other people. So I don't know if, I want to tell you a little bit about the story of Entresto, because I think it's a really interesting story, and I can tell you a little bit about, our challenges that, that I led, that led the team through with Entresto. So Entresto is a combination product, as you can see there. So it's this interesting crystal formation of sacubitril and valsartan. And valsartan was also a very important medicine for Novartis. Its trade name is Diovan, angiotensin II receptor blocker. But sacubitril is something called a neprilysin inhibitor, and it had been around for a long time. Patent had long expired, and it was just one of those products that had been bouncing around our drug discovery institute, tried it in different indications, never could get it to quite work, and really didn't understand why. So neprilysin is an enzyme that breaks down natriuretic peptides, amongst other things. And so if you inhibit its function, you will have accumulation of these natriuretic peptides, which are really beneficial in heart failure. They cause vasodilation and diuresis and protect the heart and have other kind of healing effects on the heart. But the other thing that neprilysin does is it breaks down angiotensin II. So if you inhibit neprilysin, you have this increase in natriuretic peptides, which are very helpful, but you also have an increase in angiotensin II, which, as we know, is a powerful vasoconstrictor. So that's why we never could get the drug to work in like antihypertensive trials, because the angiotensin II was working against its effects. So as we were figuring out this biology, a company down the street in Princeton, Bristol Myers Squibb, was taking a drug called omapatrolat into the clinic. And I'm sure Dr. Uhe will remember omapatrolat well. So omapatrolat was an interesting product. It wasn't two drugs. It was one drug with a dual action. And it had angiotensin converting enzyme activity as well as neprilysin inhibition. And it worked great. It had great antihypertensive effects. Bristol Myers Squibb was developing it as an antihypertensive. Showed some early promise in heart failure in a phase 2 study, and they were going big in their big phase 3 clinical trials, and they started to see tragically fatal angioedema, because the angiotensin converting enzyme actually breaks down bradykinin, and the neprilysin enzyme does as well. So if you inhibit both of them simultaneously, you get toxic buildup of bradykinin, which was leading to this fatal angioedema in some patients. So that clinical development program was stopped. So the scientists at Novartis saw this and said, hey, look, we think we may have a fix. We could take our sacubitril. We've got this. It's been sitting on the shelf, collecting dust. You have assets like that in pharma, because no one wants to be the person who out-licensed Entresto, right? So you tend to hold on to things more frequently. And so they dusted sacubitril off. They said, let's put it together with valsartan. They found a good formulation that seemed to work and deliver the right ratio, very precise dosing of the drugs, as you can see there from the amount of drugs that are delivered in each tablet. And lo and behold, this seems to work. And because we used an angiotensin II receptor antagonist, valsartan, instead of an ACE inhibitor, we didn't have as much bradykinin accumulation. And while we did have some angioedema, we didn't have the fatal angioedema that omapatrolat was seeing. And so this led to the development of Entresto into heart failure. So very, very exciting. And it just goes to show you that, sometimes you have to kind of gets to, we were talking about how unlocking all that biology and developing the chemistry and all the steps that you have to put into for drug development, really can draw on all your resources as a pharmacist to sort of figure out these problems. So the landmark clinical trial that showed the benefit of sacubitril valsartan in heart failure was called Paradigm. And like most heart failure trials, Paradigm was something called an outcomes trial, which basically means you run the trial as long as you need to in order to accumulate enough events or outcomes. In this case, we were looking for cardiovascular deaths and heart failure hospitalizations. So you just run that as long as you need to you can see a difference between your two arms. And like many outcomes trials, Paradigm is designed with statistical rules around stopping the study early for either efficacy. So if you see a really big benefit between the two arms, it wouldn't be ethical to continue. You'd want to stop it so patients could continue on the beneficial product, or for futility. So if like the curves aren't separating at all, you're like, this is never going to happen for you guys, then you could stop it early before, and you don't, subject patients to things that aren't effective, and you could make sure patients are on, continue on effective medicines that are already available. And so it's very, very, very unusual for a study to stop early for overwhelming efficacy. But that's exactly what happened with Paradigm. So I was about 18 months into the job, and I think it was the 6th. So the the study is monitored by an external review board called a data safety monitoring board, and they independently evaluate the data and they make these decisions independent of the company. We never see what they see until they tell us, and only if they stop the study. And so they decided to stop the study in end of March of 2015 for overwhelming efficacy. It turns out that that sacubitril valsartan had a 20% reduction in cardiovascular mortality, wildly exceeding our expectations for efficacy. We had actually powered the study for a 15% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. So our p-value had like 7 zeros on it by the time we presented the data. It was a highly significant trial. And so this this program at Novartis, I just want to tell you a little bit about kind of how that affected my career. Because in a big pharma company, when you have a big drug, like you're a big deal, like it's really good for your career, but it's also a lot of pressure. And so we went from this team that frankly nobody really believed would work, because most heart failure drugs don't work. If you look at the literature, it's just a graveyard of failed therapies after failed therapies. So most of the senior management really didn't. They were making a big bet, which you got to give them credit for, but they didn't believe. I think my team believed, but management didn't believe. And so when it happened, and it turns out we've got this really, really big drug, I literally doubled the size of my team within 8 weeks. Like we went from being nothing, like not even on the radar, to being the biggest drug in Novartis overnight. And I have to say the team rallied and did a great job. So that was the end of March. So this is what we had to do. So we had to bring back every patient that was in our 8,600 patient trial that we were conducting in 42 countries. They had to all come back to clinic, get their final visit. We had to collect all of the endpoints that may have happened, any event, any hospitalization, any death. You got to collect all the documents around that, because every event has to be adjudicated, again, by an independent adjudication board to make sure these are real events. And that they meet the very specific criteria and definition for these events. We had to get all that data in. We had to clean the data, reconcile it and lock the database. Then we had to write the dossiers, the regulatory documents, file those with the FDA and with Europe. And we did all that by Christmas. So end of March to Christmas. So was people worked really, really hard, and a lot of people worked really, really hard to make that happen. And it was extraordinary to be a part of that. The FDA approved the drug by July of the following year, and it was on fast track status and breakthrough status because of this extraordinary benefit that we were able to bring to patients. And so as a cardiovascular gal, I trained in cardiovascular medicine. This was absolutely the pinnacle of my career clinically. We took this medicine all the way. And, I picked it up kind of late in the game. I joined when the phase 3 trial had already started. But as Rob Califf said to me, former FDA commissioner, he said, you picked up the ball in the red zone and you took it over the goal line. So I really appreciated that analogy as a Gator. And now Entresto is on every heart failure guideline in the world as the foundational therapy for most patients with reduced ejection fraction heart failure. And so the ability to really change medicine at that scale for the greater than 20 million patients around the world that have heart failure is truly, truly meaningful, especially me having done my fellowship work in heart failure. So how do you follow up a once in a lifetime opportunity? What do you do next? So next slide. So you take a smart risk, right? That's the whole theme. You guys catching on, right? So, so I decided, I actually got invited to apply to be the Chief Scientific Officer for Novartis Canada. So what is a Chief Scientific Officer in a country affiliate of a multinational? So at Novartis, I had worked in this global role. So that means I worked with all the countries in the clinical, to execute the clinical trials, et cetera. The picture in the previous slide was me, interacting with all the countries at a big summit that we had after the results came out. But the countries is where a lot of the work gets done, right? So, it's boots on the ground. It's where the clinical trials get done, et cetera. And I had this wonderful opportunity to go to Canada and be the Chief Scientific Officer. So the Chief Scientific Officer is the main medical person for the country. So in that role, you run the medical department. And so I had a leadership team of about 12 people. They also had teams all together. The department was about 100 people. And in that, their jobs were around the traditional medical affairs jobs, medical science liaisons, and, people developing medical plans, medical education. We also did clinical development. So, we were doing work in clinical trials, mostly around after drugs were approved, or real world evidence generation, working, with big databases in the country, but also new product planning. So we, had a big pipeline, and what do we need to do to prepare the Canadian, ecosystem for these new therapies that were on their way. And while I'm super proud of what we did for Canadian patients during my time in Canada, we had the first ever gene therapies approved in Canada, and that was Luxturna and Zolgensma that we filed. 2 medicines for multiple sclerosis while I was there. And a little known fact, Canada has the highest per capita incidence of multiple sclerosis in the world. So that's very important for Canada to have those therapies available. And then our brand new medicine for macular degeneration called brolucizumab, we also got approved during my time in Canada. But one of the important things that, that you should know about the Chief Scientific Officer is that you are a steward of kind of the culture of the department. And when I left, the team did a memory book for me, and they told stories about why they appreciated my work. And that was the most meaningful, why then my leadership in that role. And they always told stories about when we were facing tough dilemmas, how I put patients first. That's what they remembered. And I think that's very important for anybody working, in drug development, is that whenever you are faced with, a really tough problem, you have to always think of the patient first. When our CAR-T team at Novartis was developing Kymriah for patients with leukemia, and they would get in these discussions, and this is very difficult, right? This engineered cell therapy, very, very difficult. It was the first one to market, and manufacturing is challenging. There's lots and lots of problems. And I guess the team would get into these discussions, and they always had someone in the meeting who was a patient advocate, who would be the voice of the patient in the room. And they said, what would our patients say about our conversation right now? Are we moving fast enough? Are we really focusing on what's most important to get these medicines to patients? And so I always try to keep that patient voice and that patient perspective in mind doing this work. And that's what my team remembered. And I'll give you 2 stories about that. One is brolucizumab. So we were about to launch brolucizumab. We had a doctor request compassionate use for brolucizumab prior to approval for a patient that had allergies to every other anti-VEGF that had been tried, and that was available. And so the team was talking about it and like, if the patient has allergic reaction to brolucizumab, that could, sort of give us, a bad reputation before we even launch and handicap us, and what would Health Canada say, and blah, blah, blah. And so these were the conversations, and I kind of stepped back, and it came, sort of popped into my head. So who are we trying to protect here? Are we protecting the patient, or are we protecting Novartis? And my therapeutic area head told me later, he said, I regretted ever asking the question, because I should have known the answer, because that's always the right answer. What is best for this patient in this particular situation? And, we talked to the doctor about the risks and the unknowns, and the doctor decided to withdraw the compassionate use request because we really didn't think this was the right therapy for the patient. And we suspected they would have an allergic reaction to brolucizumab as well. Another situation kind of along those same lines was very early after I joined the Canadian organization. And we had a very, a drug for a rare disease, which is very expensive. It's called Ilaris. And we had a patient in the hospital in Canada, a young girl, 8 years old, who was having a crisis. I think it was a juvenile arthritis crisis, and needed this drug urgently. And we have ways to provide free drug, to hospitals in Canada. That wasn't the issue. It was the timing. It was how long it was going to take, and she needed it urgently. And we got a little stuck in our process, because we're very process oriented sometimes. And I just said, look, just give it, just send it to the hospital now, and we'll just document, our deviations from our process, but just do it. The kid's suffering. We need to do it now. If I'm going to get in trouble for, taking care of a young 8-year-old girl who's suffering. I'll take, I'll follow my sword for that one. That's okay. I will get in trouble for that if that's what it comes to. Of course, it didn't come to that. And that really made a big impression with people, is that, putting that patient first. And I think that would be kind of the life lesson that I've learned from a career in industry. So maybe just Dr. Uhe does the last slide, and I'll finish up and people can ask some questions. I think it's important as you grow in your leadership to stay humble and to have fun and be a human being, be a human leader. That's probably the best advice I ever got about leadership, is just be human. And then, so the picture on the left here is me cleaning up the dishes in our rehearsal room prior to our health candidate meeting was about Zolgensma. We had our medical expert coming to rehearse with us, and the place was a bit of a tip. We had been working all day. And so I just busied myself cleaning up. Everyone was, working and going through slides. I wasn't presenting at the meeting. So, and one of my colleagues just thought it was great that the chief scientific officer would clean up the dishes. So he took this picture of me. And then the ones on the right are me just playing with my team and having fun. One's at our Ugly Sweater Christmas party, cheering on the band, who was 3 of the 4 members are from medical, so we were very supportive of them. And then the bottom one is this really cool meeting room in a hotel in downtown Montreal that had swings in it. So like, why wouldn't you swing during the meeting if you could, right? So me and Marcel hopped on the swings there and just had a little fun after the meeting. So I think that's, when you're solving really hard problems that affect patients, it's good to have a little fun and open up your mind so you can be more creative and bring better solutions. The last slide is where I am now, and that is in the white space. So my current role is working in Novartis portfolio management, looking for opportunities that aren't currently in strategy, but may be transformative for our portfolio. So the next big platform therapy, we were the first into cell therapy, one of the first into gene therapy, and we want to make sure we're the first in, the next big thing that comes along. So that's part of me and my team's goal, is to help to see around corners and to find the next big thing that may be coming for drug development and to improve patients' lives. So maybe Dr. Uhe, I could stop there and we could take some questions. That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Really enjoy it. Great. What a wonderful way to share the opportunities, what you do in the day in the life of developing products that save people's lives or improve their quality of life. And we do have a chat box, so those who have questions, please just place them in the chat box. We'll try to get through them in the next few minutes. But just want to, ask questions about risk and taking risk. And I did the same thing in regards to tenured professor. Got my first NIH grant, very comfortable in Georgia, where it was reasonably weather-wise hot, nice. And then moved up to Minneapolis to a medical device company where I was only pharmacist. There were maybe 10 pharmacists in the whole company. It was a $2 billion company at the time. So it was risk-taking. But one of the things that, how do you deal with that fear? Because fear can be paralyzing or fear can be mobilizing. And so obviously if you're paralyzed, it's not good. So how did you use that fear in a positive way to mobilize and get through some of these challenges? Like, oh my God, I think the rock's too big, but I'll give it a shot.
So I think that's a really good point. And, I've had colleagues of mine call me fearless. And I got to say that is absolutely untrue.
Right.
But I think you feel the fear and you do it anyway, right? And I think with the way that fear can help is, if at least it helps how it helps me, is to be prepared. So, I was a little nervous talking to all you guys, so I prepared really well to do this. Or I think, or hopefully it was well, it came across well. But I did prepare, and I think when I remember in the middle of the Entresto, after the study was positive, and we had all those moving parts and all those things to deliver for the organization. I went to this retreat in Switzerland, like kind of this executive, thing where you do crazy stuff like blindfold people and lead them through obstacle courses. And I remember being terrified leading this guy through this obstacle course, that I would screw it up somehow and he would get hurt because he was blindfolded. And I thought to myself, that is exactly how I feel leading the Entresto team every day. And so I just, I think the fear can motivate you to just to double check, to really prepare, to be vigilant, but you have to work through it. You have to do it anyway.
Right. Excellent. So a question came in through the Q&A, and the question's about what additional degrees did you get on your way, or additional academic training to lead such a huge effort, or was it your experiences that, I'll throw that in, it's not in the question, but was it your experiences that got you there, or was there formal training that helped get you there or helped you be successful?
So, so I did do my PharmD, which is at that time I did the entry-level PharmD, was one of the first or second or third classes. I did the residency in Chicago, and then I went back to Florida and did a fellowship with Larry Lopez in cardiovascular medicine and pharmacogenomics. And other than that, it has really been, I am a lifelong learner. I am learning constantly. I take courses, I read, I have had an executive coach. I'm just a perpetual student, but I never got any other official degrees or entered into any other, official programs. So along the way, I did sit for something called the CFA, which is a Certified Financial Analyst. And I took the test. And it's a very, very difficult test if you've ever heard of that. And I did not pass. It's a lot of math, not my strong suit, but it was, I liked the training. I really enjoyed the educational process of studying for that exam. But I think you do have to be a lifelong learner. But if you're really early in your career and you really have a penchant for business and you like that, an MBA might help. But I always found my experiences is that, it's not necessarily the letters after your name, it's what you can deliver. Let me tell you, Novartis is one of the most pedigreed places I've ever worked. I've worked with people with PhDs from Stanford, with MBAs from Wharton, same person. It's just, they were great, but they aren't necessarily, it doesn't necessarily make them, able to deliver at the level that I was delivering, frankly.
Yeah, I think it gets to be, life is your classroom, right? And it's really dealing with and learning from your experiences. And, for me, and I think most people would say this is, the lesson learned is the school of hard knocks. It's like, and so do you, we only have a minute or two, but was there a setback that's said, I never want to do that again, or hopefully won't do that again? Was there a particular setback that you learned a lot from that really helped in moving forward?
Yeah. So I was doing one of the roles I didn't mention, which was certainly a risk, was I got asked to be the general manager for a founder-led startup company. It kind of had a more developed asset that had acquired, so it wasn't like a preclinical company, but I was employee number 4 or 5. It was very, very early, and I had no business being a general manager. I was not qualified for that whatsoever. But I always said no, anyone who was qualified wouldn't have taken the job because they were a mess. And I made so many mistakes in that role. I was a terrible leader. I was working with people who frankly weren't very good and weren't very qualified for what they were doing, coming from industries outside of pharma who didn't understand. I lacked patience with them. I wasn't focused enough. I can't even count the number of mistakes I made in that role, but it was, and at the end of the day, it was probably made it about as successful as we could. Thankfully, we got a CEO in who knew what he was doing, but there was a lot of mistakes that I made in that role for sure.
Great. And then we're just about out of time, but was there I'm sure a lot of opportunities that come your way that you turned down, and how do you do that kind of risk assessment, or assessment of this is really what I want to do, or or how do you manage that type of what's next type of picture?
That's a wonderful question because, knowing what you want is probably the hardest thing to figure out. Because I like a lot of different things, right? I have attention deficit disorder. So so I think it's really is knowing yourself. And right now I've discovered, from working this. So when I was in my role in Canada, I really, I loved leading a team, but I didn't like the bureaucracy that you had in an affiliate. And it was not strategic enough because when you're in an affiliate, you're kind of executing on the global strategy. The role I'm in now is nothing but strategic. I've got a kind of a matrix team, but they're not really my team. They're kind of parts of people, and they're wonderful, but they're not mine. And then and there's no execution. Like, it's pure strategy. If we're successful, someone else executes. And so I know I need something that's a better balance. So I think it's just experimenting, figuring out what you need, trying on a lot of different things, and then you'll figure it out as opportunities come up.
I think this is a great question, even though now we're over time, but we'll finish with this. Did you find the transition from academia to industry difficult?
I did not. And I think because I pursued academia because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. When you were, like, it was my obligation as a fellowship trained pharmacist. You go into academia, you do not waste your talents on industry. They are not worthy of you. And so I went into academia and I was just not built for it. And as I started doing my consulting work, it's kind of side hustle with industry, fully sanctioned by the university, obviously, I realized that environment was what I was built for. And when I got there, I felt like a swan swimming on the water all of a sudden, like, so awkward on the shore. But once you get into the water, it's like, oh yeah, this is for me. So for me, it was actually quite easy.
And
now, what the trouble I had, Mike, let me tell you, the trouble I did have is that my former peers in academia, like, I felt like all of a sudden I was a KOL and everyone respected my opinion, and I went into industry and no one cared what I thought at that point.
Right. You become stupid all the time. Yeah. I felt the same way in my transition. I loved it. I love the fast pace. I love the all hands on deck, rowing the boat in cadence to a common goal. Like I said about academia, if there's 50 faculty members, there's 50 mission statements. And I really love being the grounding of the direction you're going, and love the fast pace. Now, I hired people out of academia, and some really struggle. They struggle with the fact that I'm being told what to do and so forth. Mm-hmm. Well, yes, you have to meet these objectives, but for people out there, the autonomy that you have in achieving your objectives, they don't tell you how to achieve the objective. That's why they hired you, to be creative, to use your intellect, to use your resources to really achieve great things. So yeah, if you're a medical device company, and if I want to go and if I'm intellectually challenged to work on gout, yeah, that's not going to work. Would work in academia because that's what you do. You have your intellectual freedom. So I have direct reports that did struggle with it, but they caught on, they figured it out. And then others just take the bull by the horn and run with it. And it sounds like you and I done it like that. So, all right, we'll finish up here. Thank you, everyone. And in 2 weeks, we'll have our next seminar speaker, and that's Reggie Groves. She's actually a colleague of mine from Medtronic, who has a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Florida. And so she's led many companies, so we'll learn from her career. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Dr. Bell. Great story, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Take care. Sorry I couldn't get everybody's questions. Thank you.